Okay. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for those of you who are online. Just about everybody's here. We welcome you to class 2 of PA 509. And tonight we're going to talk about a topic that sounds so exciting, but actually has some interesting elements to it, and that's normative frameworks. When you look at it and you've done the reading and watched the videos, philosophy, which is exactly why you came into public administration. You came to public administration to learn philosophy, and that's why we don't call it philosophy. But we should have some fun, and there's going to this, as you know, we're only doing one chapter tonight, so I do want to take the opportunity to discuss something that's been in the news very late, something that may be of particular interest to many of you, and actually talk about it from a political economy perspective. But we will do that after we have our lecture and discussion on the course material. So what we're going to do tonight is discuss chapter 1, which kind of gives you an overview of various philosophies and approaches to how people digest and process political information and policy, how they interact with their government, how the government interacts with them, their concepts of what government should be. And they, of course, relate, and you can, as you did the reading, you could probably sit there and go, okay, that's why this person acts like this is why this politician acts like that, and so on and so forth. We're also then going to do a class exercise, which is going to be the discussion that I'll talk about, and we may even apply those philosophies to our discussion. I'm not going to do it in groups like I normally do. I'm just going to have it be an open discussion. So for the sake of those that are online, just know that you'll need to participate. You can participate by chat or by voice. And then also we'll talk about the assignment for week 2. Are there any questions? All right. So I had a moment where I had those of you who take 511 know that I had a little bit of a brain freeze last on Thursday night, and the fact that I couldn't define normative, which is not a word that a lot of people use on a regular basis. It's not something you hear regularly. So you will learn about it and then you will forget it just like I did. But as easy as possible, and I don't use Vildovsky's definition, I use something a little simpler, but Vildovsky is right about what normative is. But normative frameworks, what we're really talking when we talk about normative is how things should be. And when you think about in the mind of political leaders, in the mind of commentators, elected officials, a lot of times when they advocate for agendas or policies or whatever the case may be, it's really about how it ought to be. There, of course, the famous or infamous first quote by Rush Limbaugh, the way things ought to be, and that mindset, whether you're liberal or conservative or something else, is kind of consistent with how people think. Or in this case, we also from a policy can look at it from the standpoint of given standards. What are the standards? And so that ties into this idea of normative frameworks, which generally speaking are guidelines for acceptable behaviors and decisions, which gets to political philosophy. Ideally, as human beings, and again, this gets to kind of that rational element of this supposed rational element of human beings. We want it, whatever our beliefs are, the ideal is to be consistent. So if you're a consistent conservative, you would think a consistent way on certain issues. If you're consistent progressive, you would think a certain way, and so on and so forth. And those, of course, are the two primary means. Those primarily define most people's perceived philosophies on things. Now, we know it's a little more complicated. We know that there's people that can have elements of both, but the idea is that when we have a political system or a system of government, that there is a desire for there to be a certain degree of consistency. And so this really ties into this idea that we have when it comes to morality, both from a public and private perspective. And the author in the text kind of shares it from a competing view, which I'll give you all a chance to chime in on here in a second. But it's pretty simple when it comes to understanding what public and private and public morality are. Private is your morality, or my morality as individuals. And without getting, you know, a lot of times authors have a tendency to base things in a spiritual vein. This author tries to do his best not to necessarily incorporate those elements into it, to make it as to serve as broad of an audience as possible. And basically he looks at it from the perspective of that the private morality is of course how we should behave as individuals. And then the public morality is how should government behave. Take it even a step further in that how not only should government behave, but how should society behave? Because one of the key elements to a successful government is to have a society that is relatively consistent in its behavior. There can be some variances. It gets back to what John Adams said about this country. He said that the Constitution would work for a moral people. That, of course, he had a certain definition of morality in mind based on his own beliefs, but that you can take it from a broader perspective and say that this kind of country where theoretically we attempt to the greatest extent possible with a lot of errors along the way, we attempt to try to recognize individual freedom to the greatest extent possible, that's only going to work in a society where everybody has the same moral view or is perceived by everyone else to be moral. Otherwise, it would not work in his own mind. And there are several people in both political camps disagree with what he means by morality in terms of what that actually means, would say the same thing in general. So what does the author, getting into this relationship between private and public morality, what does the author say? Or what do you think in terms of that conflict that can exist between private and public morality? Absolutely. Give me an example.
So like, how do you consider moral or immoral in public? But for me, it's like my freedom. Like that's what I like. Morally, it might be wrong to kill people, but I feel it's fine to do it because it's my liberty to do so. So
Okay.
it can be conflictual.
We can also look at it from a slightly less aggressive. We all have that idea. I'd really like for this person to expire. We'll say it that way. We all have that moment. Even Jesus had that. Even Jesus had that moment. But what I would say is, let's talk about something that is very recent in our experiences, and that's mask wearing. You know, we had, and this, I'm using this as an example. We had a situation where after a very convoluted time period, you know, this initial idea came out when COVID initially arrived to the United States, or when it was recognized that it arrived to the United States. It's likely it had come months earlier, but it was recognized that it arrived to the United States and was starting to affect people. That the initial response by a lot of people, based on what we had seen from previous other examples of viral incidents, primarily in Asia, that mask wearing should be deployed. And so everybody was told, and they were kind of encouraged to wear masks. And then something weird happened. The Surgeon General and the health officials said, no, don't wear a mask. Y'all remember that? Yeah, they actually said, don't wear masks. And they had a reason for it, but they didn't necessarily share it very clearly. And that was, we don't have enough masks yet in supply for the medical community, for the hospitals and for the doctors and for the people who really, really need them, basically, because they're the ones who are going to be in contact with COVID positive patients. We don't have enough masks for them and you, so we need to keep supply with them. And you all need to hold off, which is kind of why they said, no, just stay in your houses and your dormitories and apartments and whatever for a couple of weeks, and then we'll get it all worked out. Once they realized that they could not lock society down, I personally felt that the most they were going to be able to achieve with a lockdown was 30 days. The American people performed a lot better than I thought would happen, because I did not expect 60, 90-day lockdowns. And of course, here in North Carolina, we really only had a 60-day lockdown. I work, and I'll tell you a story. So the lockdown occurred during our budget season. In North Carolina, municipal budgets and state budgets are prepared on a fiscal year that begins July 1st, which means in the spring, most cities and counties are working on preparing their budgets for presentation to council, typically around Memorial Day. And so I'm in the middle of taking in requests from departments and reviewing budgets and trying to make decisions. And then this happens. Also right around my birthday. But that's not important. So we had throughout the month of March, we realized something was going to happen. And so we started working on continuity of operations plans, which are plans, and you can probably explain this a lot better than I could. But these are plans that exist so that if something happens to an organization, you are still able to operate and provide services as required. So for the case for most of our operations, it was for those essential those services that we have to continue providing on a daily basis. How are we going to do it if we're having to send a whole bunch of people home, because that's what the state's telling us to do? So we worked that out. And what I realized was I could send my analyst home and have them work from home, but I needed to be in City Hall. And the main reason for that was because at the same time this was going on, we had limited technological resources, and it was not easy for me to access the enterprise software that I needed to use to be able to manage the budget and do other things at the city from my house. My analyst didn't need that, but I had to have it, so I needed to stay at the office. So I never took a day off during COVID. I drove into work. Now there weren't a lot of people in my office, and so I had to answer the phones and do other stuff while I was there, but that was the case. And the state put a hard lockdown for as hard of a lockdown as North Carolina was capable of. Certainly not. You lived in other states, you may have experienced more severe and significant lockdowns than we did here. But they did that for about 2 months. And then after that, they came forward with a whole host of ideas on regulations, like one-way aisles in grocery stores and a whole host of stuff that didn't work. And then of course, they also said you should wear a mask. And you see, in this state in particular, you would see varying levels of social compliance with that standard. If you happen to be in the Triangle or in Asheville or in other major cities, you would see a much higher tendency for people to wear masks in public. If you have a Rocky Mount, we say there are more people now wearing masks when I go into a grocery store, because these are individuals who haven't gotten vaccinated or won't get vaccinated or have particular health issues and have just kind of accepted certain risk and just have certain behaviors that they've adopted than there were when COVID was at its highest. And my manager is no longer my manager. She's no longer employed with the city, so I feel comfortable saying this, and I'm not trying to cut her down just from that. I asked her simply, I said, are we going to try to enforce any of this? Are we going to tell our police to try to enforce anything, mask requirements, limited occupancy in buildings or any occupancy limits in buildings or anything like that? She said, absolutely not. We had no interest in putting our police or any civilian official in a position where they were trying to enforce rules that we could generally tell that the public had no interest in complying with. So, public, if we're trying to be consistent with what the state was telling us, we should have behaved a certain way. And obviously, if you were but we realized privately, most people were like, it's not that big of a deal. And you can look at how I would say the easiest way to look at it is look at how our residents in Nash County and Edgecombe County voted in the 2020 presidential election compared to Wake County. That can be one example, and there's some other examples as well. Yes.
I have an example that I remember.
Sure.
Speaking of normative philosophy, as philosophy undergrad as well, so.
I hope you didn't take
No,
anything.
not
I
at
hope
all,
you
not
didn't.
at all. It's just, that's why I about where your personal morality or ethics framework can conflict with your public morality or ethics framework, or your theory on like how the government should behave. So one good example is like kidney donations. Say there's a person and you are a match for their kidney and their kidneys are failing, so you can give them one of your kidneys, still be able to live, function normally, and they'll actually be able to live too. In the scenario where someone comes up to you and says, would you donate your kidney so that they can live? Most people would probably say, if you can guarantee me I'll be fine, whatever, sure. Generally speaking, most people would find that okay. But force you, if you have a healthy kidney, to donate it to someone else, most people are going to say, no.
Right.
Where what you think someone ought.
Absolutely. And that's absolutely true. I mean, that's one of the discussions we had with kidney donations specifically, and liver donations in the 1990s was about donating to chronic alcoholics. Two most famous ones were Mickey Mantle and Pat Summerall, both involved in sports. One's an athlete broadcaster and one's an athlete, both of whom suffered liver failure as a result of their alcoholism, and both received transplants. And there was a lot of debate at that time as to should they have received transplants because they had self-inflicted their behavior. Now, this was at a time when the general consensus about addiction in the 1990s was that it was that it was primarily self-inflicted. It was a choice. We have a different view about addiction now than we did back then, in that we recognize, based on acceptance of research, that a lot of addiction is due to things that you are born with, natural tendencies that you're born with. Sometimes those addictions manifest themselves in ways that will not affect you physically, and other times they are ways that will affect you physically. And we still got a lot of room to go in that way. Previous policies on addiction, particularly when it comes to drugs. So the reality, those are all good examples. Going back to the mask, we had, as I think I said to y'all before, my wife and daughter are Jewish, so we had High Holy Day services virtually that year, and the rabbi decided to focus on the morality of mask wearing. And he talked about the fact that he talked about from the perspective of, he was upset because of how it was affecting him personally through his family. He had a parent or grandparent, I don't remember which one, that was in an assisted living facility in South Florida. And at this facility, the nurses, when they're working in there, wear masks. The problem, and they're all wearing masks. The problem is that, as you know, Florida in general, by fall of 2020, the state had pretty much said, we're not going to enforce almost anything. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. Yeah,
If
so
you want, you can go ahead.
oh, sorry.
No, you can go ahead.
Yeah.
Let me finish, and then you can chop. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So what had happened was that because of the fact that everybody in society was wearing masks and the nurses could not guarantee their safety, the way that the nurses, the way this facility judged it was, because we can't guarantee that our nurses are not going to be infected out in the community doing the things they need to do in the community, we have to do the best to protect him here, which meant that he couldn't go visit his grandmother or mother in Florida. She was going to be isolated for that reason. Now go ahead.
I work in the senior living facility. But anyway, from the beginning of the pandemic, I was in Florida for 2 months, and it was very different, like day and night, from being in North Carolina and mask wearing in Florida. So West Melbourne around Palm Bay, yeah, and they did not really enforce, or pretty much we were talking about, and then like being in a senior living facility, you don't know what the nurse is or who's working there, what are they doing outside. of work, you know, it might put the resident at risk and stuff, you know, especially assisted living residents.
Well, it's also like my wife has medical issues,
Yeah.
so we had to be very careful for an extended period of time. And one of the decisions we made was obviously in the second half of the 2020 school year, the school that my daughters goes to, which is a private school, they decided to go remote for a period of time and they allowed hybrid to finish out. They made a decision that they would go back starting in August of 2021, they would go back to full hybrid, which meant parents could drop their kids off or they would have remote. 95% of parents chose to send their kids back. So they were supposed to be wearing masks and doing all this, but my wife, because we had to decide for our daughter that she was going to stay at home and go remote. And so my daughter was basically like the only child in her class that was usually, unless the kids had gotten infected and were having to go stay at home because they were infected, she was the only one there that was going remote. And it challenged her because some of the teachers didn't care. The rooms were not set up like this room was. It was like a laptop somewhere that they could
There's
see.
a 6 feet, you know, distance.
And all that. And what I was hearing from people was that the teachers, the kids were relatively doing what they should have done at home and at school. The worst cases were the teachers of this particular school. Not talking about teachers at other schools. I'm only using this school as an example. I don't want to broadly generalize. But they were out, you know, partying and doing stuff like that, like they normally did, and they were getting infected regularly. Most of our infections were teachers, not students. And I will go ahead and say this. There is going to be a lot of analysis and research and evaluation about what we did, particularly with children, as a result of this pandemic. What we tried to do to mitigate it, what the action we took with mitigation, as well as vaccination and all that. There's going to be a ton of research and there's going to be a ton of lessons learned, and we're going to need to learn those lessons because the chances are with globalization that something like this could happen again. Just don't know. But there is a tremendous number of lessons learned, and that's something we're going to have to work on. Any other examples people have? Any other ideas or thoughts? Sure.
So maybe you are gonna get to this. So as public servants, what's the line that you have to draw? Like on private and public morality per se, like to your example, your manager still making decisions for the public. And even though they're not the state, still it's a government thing.
So this is a challenge, and I can only speak as a professional working in the United States. So I will go ahead and just say that for the whole audience. I can only speak as a professional working in the United States. Because a lot of that not only depends on, a lot of it depends on where you work and how structures of government are set up. Always have a responsibility to uphold the law. You always have a responsibility to do that. There is this concept of discretion that gives you some flexibility with respect to how to do that. This is very important, particularly with respect to law enforcement officers, because they have to apply discretion on a daily basis. And they can do it the right way, or they can do it the wrong way. And a lot of times where they do it right or wrong, they're going to have to answer for it. What we have to do is we have to keep in mind that in this particular country or world, if we are trying, in this particular country, if we're trying to uphold the primacy of respecting the individual and respecting their liberty, we have to constrain ourselves. We have to put a limit on our power and our authority to make sure that it remains below a point that people begin to just simply ignore it or revolt against it. Go ahead.
I guess that also ties into law enforcement or police officers. You can't like force people to use certain things, and people like tell them so many times and stuff. And if they decide to listen or not to listen, then you don't want it to be like I guess like people like rioting and stuff and causing more chaos and stuff, and then like people going against, I guess, police officers, law enforcement, or workers, like let's say shopping. Let's say you're at the mall going to a store, let's say TJ Maxx or something, you know, the mask requirement, and then it's required to come into the store with a mask on, but not everybody comes into the store with a mask on. You can't like follow them and say, hey, you know, it's all like, you know.
I was gonna say, going back to that particular example with masking into retail establishments. When the state was trying to figure this out, and this would actually be something to talk about later this semester with respect to coordination. But you had the governor's office, you had the various departments that were part of the task force led by public health. And they would make their recommendations, and there were various actors, public and private, who would try to insert input. When it came to retail, it was the various lobbying groups that represent retailers here in the state. And sometimes their argument would be, you know, purely, we don't want our companies losing business, or think about this company's business. But sometimes they had excellent points, and they would say, so you're operating a grocery store. It doesn't matter if it's a mom and pop or a food. You're operating a grocery store. Who's likely to be the person that's going to be in a position at an entrance when somebody's coming in? Which type of employee is likely to be the one to do that? Some at Walmart, absolutely. But
Frontline employee.
a frontline employee, likely, and they would use this example because I heard them use it on a conference call, a younger employee. An employee who has never been given that kind of authority ever in their organization, has always just been told, do this, do that, you know. And you're putting someone who's the lowest paid, you know, among the lowest paid people in the organization, in the company, into a position where they have to tell a customer, where they have to somehow convince a customer without making them mad to be able to say, to convince them to do something that clearly if they haven't done it, chances are they don't want to do it.
Yes. And then they could put them at risk, you know,
Yeah.
of like an argument or even like your health or like
Right. So what the retailer said is, you can recommend it, you can suggest it, you can encourage it all you want, just don't mandate. That's what they said here in North Carolina. Now, other states in this country have different levels of the relationship of authority between the government and their people, just like other countries do. And so the reality is that what happened, of course, here in North Carolina is not the same as happened in California, not the same as what happened in Florida. 3 different degrees. California, extremely restricted to the point of dumping sand into skate parks to prevent kids from going to skate parks. Florida, highly unrestricted, and us trying to find some kind of middle ground. Yes.
So you have brought up California, but then local municipalities to enforce.
In California.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
referring to California.
And that was another case because same case as we are. There was kind of an expectation that local law enforcement in North Carolina would comply with whatever was requested. But pretty much every sheriff in North Carolina, with the exception of a few counties, mostly urban counties, said, we're not doing anything. And when we heard that, we said, we're not doing it. In Rocky Mount. Here in Raleigh, they did a lot more. In Durham was probably the most restrictive of Durham and Asheville were probably the 2 most restrictive cities in North Carolina. Durham actually instituted an outdoor mask mandate for a period of time. Asheville's Asheville. And so my wife is from there. Asheville is Asheville. And but then to kind of give an example to you, and then I'll take some other comments. The protest that happened nationwide after the video was released of what happened in Georgia, in Minnesota. Legally speaking, those protests could have been discouraged or not happened because technically mass gatherings were not supposed to be allowed. But elected leaders and law enforcement personnel in most cases realized That's something we can't do. If we do that, it could be even worse, first of all. Regardless of what they were trying to do politically, or they actually did sympathize with the situation, they realized that that was not an action they could take. So they made the judgment to say, we're not going to prevent this from happening, even though technically the policies and everything that we've set in place would say this shouldn't happen. Yes.
Oh, no.
No, I'm just,
Oh, yeah.
you get something else.
Oh, yeah, back to what you were saying. So during the beginning of the pandemic, I was working at Habitat for Humanity downtown Durham, which is right across from City Hall, and yeah, they were very like strict on everything, and I was one of the people that did stay in the office.
Yeah. Yeah, Durham and Asheville during COVID, during that first year, 18 months of COVID were the most restrictive in North Carolina. They followed the governor's executive orders to a T and then took whatever authority was extended to them, which is very rare that we extend authority to local governments in North Carolina that they don't already have. They extended that, they use that as well. Yes.
So if I remember correctly, in Wade, your idea for mask enforcement was to put it on the establishment, that if for some reason law enforcement was either called there or walked in, public health or whatever, and saw low compliance, they could fine the business person, the owner, not the individuals who are maskless.
And that was consistent with the executive order.
Right.
But that was with the end, that was kind of hope, that was enough to the county to decide how much are we going to spot check.
Right.
You know, how much are we going to then, you know, are we just going to go start driving around and, you know, just kind of look and see, or are we going to, you know, it's going to have to be a call, and it's going to have to be a type of situation where the folks that respond to that are actually going to be concerned about that while they're trying to deal with the reason why they were called.
Yeah, someone said to me, it was kind of like calling in a rat in a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they would respond if they received prompting, but they weren't necessarily going to go into trouble.
Yeah, and typically in North Carolina is more of a complaint initiated state when it comes to a lot of things. Local governments don't have a lot of power to enforce standards. Like, for example, one of the biggest challenges we have in this state is the condition of residential property, particularly rental property. And the laws in North Carolina really don't give municipalities or counties that are engaged in enforcing housing code the ability to just walk into, if we see something, just walk into a place and check it out. You pretty much have to call us, which puts the tenant into a difficult situation, because then the landlord 99% of the time is going to say, you called us in, and then they're going to try to initiate an eviction. There have been efforts to try to change that, and every time that happens, it basically gets KO'd. So those things do happen. Anybody else? Yes.
I was just gonna say the only, another example that I thought of was just the kind of battle around like K-12 education and what's taught in the classroom right now.
Yeah.
So what parents think should, or what some parents think should be said or taught, or way it should be taught versus actual educators who are trained to teach. Should be taught. So there's just, yeah.
And it deals, and here it deals with, it gets to the case of how much authority and responsibility does a parent have over their child. If you're somebody who believes from a moral perspective that the child is mine and anything that he or she is involved in is my discretion, which means that I will accept it if it aligns with me, but I'll reject it if it doesn't align with me, you're going to look at obviously one way. If you're someone that looks at it from the perspective of, yes, I have responsibility over my child, I think everybody believes that they have core responsibility over their child. But I recognize the response that the child is not going to be mine every minute of every day, particularly once they get to the age where they're being educated. And we have a law in this state that says a child, it's constitutional, I believe, that the child should be educated. We have different ways of doing that, but they are to receive an education one way or another. That then those influences have to be respected to a certain point. And that's, of course, becoming a major issue. And of course, this is not the case here in North Carolina. But in other states, it's gotten to the point where where parent groups, like with the help of politicians, have basically facilitated the principle that not only should we do what we've done in the past with vouchers, but we should simply say whatever the state raises on a per pupil basis for school funding should be portable with the student in its entirety. And that's happened recently in Arizona, where and they call it school choice. It's really, it's portability is what it is. And it basically says that if a parent wants to take their kid out of a public school and move them to a private school or homeschool them, you not only allow it, but you also then have to give them the full credit value of their per pupil allotment, which is a considerable amount of money. And so around $7,000, I think, in Arizona. And this is being done in response to political and philosophical views in terms of what kids are learning or being taught in school systems. So that is a case of this. And of course, and it also gets to the public and private morality when it comes to education of how much responsibility do we have to make sure that our society is educated. Because on one hand, I believe that a parent does have the right and responsibility to do what they believe is best for their child. And I would never want to take that away from anyone, even if I didn't think it was necessarily, I wouldn't want to take that away. At the same time, I also believe that I have a responsibility to make sure that other children are educated because it's to the betterment of society overall. So you kind of have to weigh those two out. So I don't mind paying taxes for schools. I don't mind paying for sending my kid to private school either. So that's just the way it is. Any other thoughts? Okay. So now let's talk about the types of normative frameworks that are discussed in chapter 1. And they kind of line up into two groups. First are consequentialists. What does consequentialist mean? Yes.
Should be the best course of action, morally based.
Right, trying to predict what will result from action and saying whatever the best potential or the desired action is how you should make a decision. And to be honest, the two concepts, two frameworks that are discussed that align with consequentialism generally reflect the primary types of framework that we have in the United States. The utilitarian and the egalitarian. And they are in some ways very similar. There are some differences, and to a lot of people, they can be merged together. And if there was a way to describe a traditional American normative framework, it would be a combination of the two, for the most part. So what is utilitarianism? Yes.
It's kind of like the most good for the most people.
Mhm.
Not really worried about morality, but you're just concerned about just like having the best overall. It's not really the thought process. It's just more of like kind of a numbers game, I guess.
Absolutely. Trying to create the greatest potential yield for society. So someone think of an example of a policy where you kind of give me an example where you're working through a policy concept and you're saying, how would that apply? Because you have a situation where, I mean, we know the phrase, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So let's think of one up. Yes, sir.
Oh, would it be like healthcare for all, like something like that?
That's a good one. In what way do you, how would that would be a good example. So let's think about from a utilitarian perspective, what is the conflict that leads you to, I'm assuming you're saying that we should do it.
Right.
So how do you address, what's the conflict and how do you address it? And how would you address it? How would you justify from a utilitarian perspective?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Come back to me.
Okay, I'll go with her. Okay.
It's a straight numbers game. If we're forcing some, say that it was healthcare for all with a tax, it's a hefty tax on people who make more than. I don't know.
Enough to pay for it, right?
Yeah, you're hurting those people, technically speaking, it's a numbers game. They're losing money, negative, however much in taxes. But you're giving something to everyone in the United States who qualifies and healthcare for all. The is way greater than the detriment.
Mhm.
And then in that case, the end justifies.
Okay, excellent. Yes.
I was gonna say like another, good example of,
That would qualify when it was done. Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk, I'll talk about both. Let's talk about healthcare for all, or universal healthcare, as it's also known. So we talked about the cost side. We looked at it from a cost benefit. That's a cost benefit perspective, that theoretically that if you distribute the cost in a certain way to be able to produce the yield of the benefit, that it creates the most benefit for all, because you're trying to apply the cost to the smallest, to a small number of people. And that's a game as old as time itself. Yes,
So I'm like thinking, I've heard people say like it would decrease their quality.
right, and yeah, so,
Type of healthcare.
right, because there's another way to look at it from a utilitarian perspective, and that's supply and demand. Because in most goods and services, there is a limited supply of a given good or service. That is true in healthcare. Doesn't mean it can't increase, but the supply is whatever it is at a given time. And we've learned from examples in other countries that have applied universal healthcare. Great Britain, Canada, other countries in the world that have this principle. And a challenge that they run into, it hasn't steered them away from it, but a challenge that they run into is that there's only going to be so much healthcare that they can create to provide for their residents, to provide for their citizens. Some of you may be involved in the medical profession. You said you were in senior care. Yeah. Some of you also may have roles in the medical profession. One of the biggest challenges right now in the medical profession is finding people. Doctors, PAs, NPs, nurses, technicians, having the facilities, having the amount of care necessary to serve a country of 350 million people. And that's without having the guarantee that care will be provided, which does put a limit on demand. So in the current market, because it is market driven and it's not guaranteed, there is a certain limit on demand. Demand is growing, but it is constrained to some degree. But if you make it a guarantee, if you say to everybody that it is a right, then and you construct it in that way, which is what you're technically doing by creating universal healthcare. What you're doing is that you're basically creating a situation where demand will increase considerably. And we've seen this in cases even here in the United States where we've tried to do this. We did it in Tennessee in the 90s. Massachusetts did it to some degree in the 2000s under Romney's administration there. There have been state experiments, and we did see a significant increase in demand when the Affordable Care Act was passed in the late 2000s, 2009, 2010. So we've kind of seen this, and the challenge is, as you point out, the quality issue, because you can't maintain quality if your supply and demand don't work. And if supply continues to be constrained because you only have so many medical schools and so many people wanting to, or nursing schools or training facilities, and only so many people want to go into the profession. Only so many people are qualified to go into the profession. So, because I wanted to be a paramedic, but I can't. But I learned, unfortunately, as a teenager, that I can't stand the sight of blood after a certain point. The reality is that something's going to have to be. And the concern then becomes, it's about quality, but it's also about availability. And this is where then it can be taken to a political extreme, and we talk about concepts like death panels, which I'm not saying exist. These are this was an opposing political view, but the idea that technically you could end up in a situation where you have 5 people that need the same life-saving procedure, but you only have enough supply to provide it, like say, to 2 of them. So then you have to decide which 2 of those 5 get. And, then you have to start, for lack of a word, playing God. And that's kind of I'm not saying that would happen or should or is going to happen. That, of course, was created to stoke fear into people that was used as a political tool by opponents of the plan to stoke fear into people. It does, however, theoretically, if you look at it from an economics perspective, it is possible. That's why economics is called the dismal science, because it deals with dismal things like that we don't want to think about. Yes.
And then, I don't know if I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead too
No.
far, but
That's fine.
I asked the critique of the utilitarianism framework for a government or in general is that if you strictly follow utilitarianist framework, you can often justify doing really morally awful things in order to get a good result. So like one example, which is sort of like a pseudo-electoral example, is if you had 5 people who were dying if they didn't get certain organs and 1 healthy person who had the organs they need. Utilitarianism would say you have to kill that person and give all their body parts to the people who need it to save the 5 people.
Right.
Or I forget, but the one
The Patriot Act.
yeah, the Patriot Act. That it's almost similar because Patriot Act justification is protecting people,
Mhm.
but how do they do that? Is a massive invasion of privacy, a right
Correct.
that we all have held really dear. So you can't strictly follow it and always get results that are agreeable.
So I'll give you an example that did happen in North Carolina that tells us exactly how bad utilitarianism can be if it's applied to an extreme like that. So for about 50 years in the mid 20th century, North Carolina advocated and implemented a medical selection process known as eugenic sterilization, which some of you are probably aware of. It was actually most promoted by the public health director of Mecklenburg County, who was also Charles Peralta's famous broadcaster, Charles Peralta's father. But basically, it was based on certain readings of evolutionary Darwinist principles. Eugenics kind of comes out of Darwinism, the wrong side of Darwinism. And the idea being that if people possess certain perceived defects, that's their term, not mine, that it would be best to prevent them from being able to have children. And so when these circumstances were identified in health patients that were coming to the public health system, they would sterilize them, make them unable to have children. And it was being done with the idea that by doing this, we were minimizing the future costs to society, that we were actually helping society by taking this one person, or really in the case, tens of thousands of people. And we were eliminating their ability to procreate, because then we wouldn't have to deal as a society with the offspring. Extremely brutal, extremely inappropriate, evil in its own terms, something that the state has apologized for, but has not necessarily done the appropriate restitution for, that was done, that had a utilitarian argument for it. Yes,
Were they black?
they were black, white.
Oh, and I just.
It was all over the board.
I'm just trying to
No, I understand. No.
understand their argument and justification for it, because I just.
You have to. It was eugenics at its time when it was first developed in the late 19th century. It came out of Darwinism. It was when Darwinism came along in the mid 1800s. There were a tremendous number of ways that people interpret it and apply it. And yes, race was one. But they also basically were looking at eyes, they used it to justify going after Jews and any other, in other nationalities, various ethnicities, people based on how their eyes looked. And then also they were looking at people who had mental deformities, physical deformities, those people who weren't considered perfect. Yes, I'm sorry, ma'am, in the back.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say. So it wasn't like. Counties like Mecklenburg, which are
Mhm.
historically like black county state where it had like.
Right, and also they did not have the means to defend themselves in the judicial system to prevent themselves from being caught that way. So you're absolutely right. There was an example that was published earlier this year following the Dobbs decision. I think it was in it was the Washington Post. It talked about a woman who was from North Carolina. She's now in her 60s, but when she was 14, she was raped, and she was black, and she's black, and she was, I think they aborted the child, but they also sterilized her. Yeah. So that's, I mean, this is probably, there's a lot of bad things that have happened in North Carolina. I'm not saying that that's the only one, clearly. But in terms of when you look at in more recent history at things that the government endorsed in effect and actually did on their own, didn't just allow, but actually instituted and performed, this is up there. And we still haven't really dealt with it. And we still deal, eugenics of course, historically, when people think of eugenics, we think of the Nazis. They're the ones we think of the most because some people have argued that they actually learned it from the Americans that were practicing it at the time and then took it to a 10th degree because they did. Yes, and Lindsay's right. A negative example would be the COVID policies in China. China's kind of, we have to be careful about separating Chinese people from the Chinese government. The Chinese government, if you've probably followed the news this year, had a wave of COVID. When COVID initially happened, they tried to shut it down as best they could. What we've learned from COVID is the same thing we've learned from just about every airborne respiratory virus. It's going to hit you eventually. You can try to fight it, you can prepare for it, but you can't prevent it from eventually getting you. The last time this happened, the last major incident like this was the Spanish flu epidemic of the late 1910s. And that's the flu we have today. If everybody gets a flu shot for it. So the reality is it's going to hit you eventually. The Chinese government, for some reason, has continued to say, no, we're not going to get it. We're going to keep you from getting it, and have instituted some extremely oppressive lockdowns. The ones that they've done more recently, where they basically seal people into their apartments and they're sitting there starving to death because they can't get food, because they're saying, well, we'll deliver the food. Well, there's not enough people to deliver the food. There's not enough food centralized to be able to cook it. That's a serious issue. Yes.
So I just have a problem with understanding the measure of utility or well-being, just because it seems so abstract.
It
seems
is.
like each individual person can apply it in a different way based on their own preconceived notion. Really understand how you could universally apply it to anything because of that individualistic nature of it.
And that's another problem. That's another weakness of it. It's based on a general acceptance of it, of what is considered to be valued, or what's the goal, or what's the value of it. And I would say honestly, it's outdated. Like back, in an earlier time, and I'm trying to be very careful with what I'm going to say. There were more common, very simple measures because life at that time was about survival and to some degree improvement, but the survival was more significant, even in the time of the founding of this And so those concepts were easier to define. Now, because we all have modernized, developed, and expanded, we have a higher quality of life in general than we did even 50 years ago, let alone 250 years ago. It becomes more difficult because we all can, as you point out, we can all kind of define or can find value in different ways. There are still certain things that we should try to have some general understanding, some general agreement on. But more or less, it becomes more individualized over time. And so that is a challenge, that is a limitation and a weakness of utilitarianism. And that's why, honestly, it's not as applicable in today's world as it once was. It's certainly an element of who we have been for a long period of time, but it has weakened in terms of its influence. So that leads us into egalitarianism. So what's that? Somebody hasn't gone yet. I'm sorry, yes.
It says in the book that it's the equality is the principle of justice.
Yep, justice. Which, how would we apply that? What's an example of that application? Anybody else?
Affirmative action, like how, or civil rights act. But I think affirmative action is usually the most common thing.
Affirmative action is an example. This computer wants to update for some reason. Affirmative action. Because I mean, it was instituted at a time when there was a serious issue in terms of representation.
Title IX.
Yeah, that was Title IX is a little more Title IX and affirmative action both. So we'll talk about both. Affirmative action was developed at a time when it was clear that there were serious deficiencies, inequities, disparities in the accessibility, in particular, that Blacks had with respect to opportunities in the environment, in society, whether it be education, jobs, careers, access to housing, financial opportunity, financial resources, whatever the case may be. And there was considered to be a need, a matter of justice, to inject an opportunity for those groups that had been maligned and devalued and oppressed in the past. Title IX was the idea, and it's, we don't, obviously affirmative action is not as prevalent as it used to be and has been in some cases eliminated. But Title IX is still in existence and it deals with equality between genders. It's like, how many of y'all have ever seen 6 women basketball? What? 6 women basketball. No, go ahead.
Was it when it's more?
It's
how they used to play.
It's how they used to play women's basketball. It's how my grandmother played women's basketball when she played in high school. Until the 1970s, 1980s, and in Iowa until the 1990s, women's basketball, the teams had 6 players. They would have 3 on backcourt and 3 on front court. Because it was perceived that women didn't have the endurance to be able to travel the entire court. That was the reason. Obviously, we know that that's false. And generally speaking, in colleges and universities, high schools, and other establishments, there was generally a perception that women were not capable of doing certain things that were just assumed that men could do. That obviously has proven to be a lie. There may be biological differences in ability in certain ways, but in general, women can do just about everything that a man can do in terms of actually being able to do it. And in some cases, there is no difference. Like, for example, the university I went to as an undergrad, Tennessee Tech, won the first national championship that the NCAA issued in a women or co-ed sport, which was in rifle. Because A woman can shoot as good as a man. There's no difference in that. So we decided and realized that we needed to establish an equality of opportunity, which he talks about in the book, an equality of opportunity with respect to women in sports and in other pursuits. Because Title IX doesn't just apply to sports. Like, for example, I'm a member, I joined a fraternity in college, but my fraternity is a little different. It's a service fraternity, not a social fraternity. Now, socially speaking, you had fraternities in sports, but in service, you just had us. And we were actually required in the 1970s to actually become a co-ed organization. It was pretty much mandated by Title IX. So nationally, we became a co-ed organization at that point. It led to this idea that there should be equality of opportunity for women in various activities. Mainly, we think of it with respect to sports. And of course, at the college level, that's led to significant proliferation of women's sports programs. There have been times where schools, in order to try to balance their athletics budgets, have said, and to do things that are a little nefarious, have said, okay, well, in order to keep this women's program, we're going to cut this men's program, which is something they shouldn't really do. They should figure out a way to make it work otherwise. But the reality is that that's a very important thing to do. And of course, it also applies to scholarship opportunities and other things. And I'm old enough to remember even when Title IX was in effect, it was certainly unequal. And as we've even seen in more recent examples, there's still examples of inequalities, like what happened at the women's national basketball tournament a couple of years ago, where they went to those centralized locations and they were basically handing them yoga mats, which I sat there and I was like, and I grew up in Tennessee, where obviously everyone knows the UT women's basketball program. Pat Summit had them playing against guys and had them lifting weights 20 years ago. So, I mean, you kind of get the idea. Yes.
In regards to Title IX, as it has been interpreted as an executive policy around campus, universities do need to respond to allegations of sexual misconduct.
Right.
That also the public framework of universities. If like the debate becomes that universities are overstepping their boundaries, but the argument for having the Title IX hearing is that it's very egalitarian, where mostly, generally speaking, it's typically women, but not always. And the university should take action to stop or dismay the action, but in its result, it can be viewed as an overstep of boundary of penalizing people who are.
Right, because and it gets to a core issue that universities, particularly large universities, state universities, have had a problem with for generations. And that is when you look at what's known as the town and gown relationship between the cities, the towns and municipalities where universities are located, universities themselves. Universities basically try to be a kingdom unto themselves. And I've seen it firsthand. Like I said, I grew up in a college town my entire youth life. Had a university of 8,000 to 10,000 students. It was our largest employer, and it was. My dad was a professor for 35 years. Understood that and saw it firsthand. If it happened on campus, the university, regardless of what it is, and obviously sexual abuse, rape, other violent crimes against women, were that case, and even harassment. And the situation was the school would try to deal with it, and in reality, it was not to the benefit of the woman in almost every circumstance, because it did not give them the equal justice that they would have received, hopefully under law, in the traditional justice system. And we are doing better than we did 20 years ago, but there are still a lot of deficiencies, and we know that. My view at this point is when you look at it that, in all honesty, universities should not have their own police forces. I'm just gonna say that. Now, I understand there's a need to supplement police, and the university and the community have to work on that. But my sister was a student at Virginia Commonwealth, which, if you know anything about it, is kind of a town, is kind of a campus that's kind of intersects with downtown Richmond. She was violently attacked by a former boyfriend. She's been open in public about this, so this is not secret information. Before her 21st birthday, he swore a warrant out with a magistrate and had her arrested. So my sister, on her 21st birthday, when that happened, was actually in jail. Now, the local police, the university police, and all of that worked through it, and she was able to get out and get a record expunged and all that. He's now residing in a prison in Western North Carolina on another incident that he had. But the reality is, it is a very difficult situation, and trying to have two different law enforcement agencies at the local level trying to deal with it is not good for anybody. And then we talk about the university's role from standpoint of its own disciplinary rules and its disciplinary standards. There is this conflict that we have about, one, doing what's right for those students who have been wronged, who have been attacked, who have been assaulted. And at the same time, trying to make sure that the system of justice for the student who's been accused of these actions is as close to possible or as exact as possible to what the standards would be in the traditional court system. That's the challenge that we have. Lindsay, you bring up Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Explain that one. I'm not as familiar with that one.
Just within the workplace, how you can't discriminate against pregnant. But I was also going to say it is kind of a gray area, because I think employers who have under 15 employees can get away with more of that.
Yeah,
discrimination.
Most laws that provide rights and guarantees in the workplace have limitations with respect to how they can be applied. And it's based on the number of employees, and it's done under the auspices, and it's kind of I don't even know how I would describe it, but it's done with the belief that if you're trying to start a business, you're not necessarily going to have the resources to be able to deal with regulatory issues. Like, for example, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, they put in a provision that said it doesn't apply to employers with less than 50 employees. That was the intent of that. And for pregnancy discrimination.
If you're asking me a question, I'm hearing it's like breaking up every once in a while.
Okay, let me come closer to the computer, because you said that there's a restriction on it, that it does not apply to employers with less than 15 employees, correct?
Yeah, I think you can, that specific discrimination, it's like Title VII or something. That was, yeah, part of the civil rights movement is when that was added. But I think in North, it's like different in every state. But in North Carolina, I believe you can file a complaint, but it's I just know someone who got fired when she was pregnant, and we had less than 10 employees, so she really didn't have any legal recourse.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the challenges of egalitarianism, is that justice, its ideas of justice are based on law. And unfortunately, while we attempt for justice to be blind, law is not always blind. The worst kind of all discrimination is bad, but the worst kind is that which is actually facilitated by law or encouraged by law. And that is a limitation to it, because in order for egalitarianism to work, you have to have an environment, and you have to be able to facilitate a culture of justice where the principles our focus where everyone agrees in the concept of equal justice. Right now, we have this political debate going on, and it's going on both sides, about are politicians basically above the law? And each side brings up their own examples of this politician, they're getting away with stuff and they're not being charged. This politician's holding records at his hotel / home / social club, and he's not being charged. You get the idea. So there are a lot of things that are going on that can challenge this view. Any other thoughts that anybody has with respect to egalitarianism? Now we go into deontological frameworks. So what do we mean by a deontological framework? What does that mean? Yes. Whereas with utilitarianism, we're looking at consequences. With deontological, we're looking at moral views. Now, moral views can be different. The examples up here are first of all, they're not necessarily interchangeable, but they reflect how someone has their moral structure, their view of morality, which can be different from person to person or group to group. So the first one is generally called Kantianism, after its primary influencer, Kant. And it deals with this idea known as the categorical imperative. What is the categorical imperative? Yes, yeah. It's go ahead, give it your best shot. Yeah.
It's difficult even after studying it for years sometimes. We need to do the most good while respecting the humanity of each person, the phrase the end of because as an end, you have to treat them.
So it's the idea that there are limitations to what we can do. It can be applied, I should say, it can be applied that there are limitations that we can do, even if it has the potential to benefit others. Because it does hold in its plate, it does hold the idea that everyone is entitled to a certain level of value that cannot be taken from them. So for example, in the organ donation example, you would not kill that person. You would say it is wrong, morally speaking, it's wrong to kill, so it is wrong to take a life to save a life. And so even if you could save 5 lives with one, you still respect the one. The death penalty would be an example. The idea that somebody has committed a capital crime. In the United States, that is murder, and in a few places, rape. And the idea being is that person has wronged someone to the point that that person is either dead or has been permanently damaged. And the matter is that person should not only lose their freedom through incarceration, but also should lose their life. And someone morally could say it is still wrong to take that life because we have an obligation to respect life. That is not a majority view, but but those views with respect to that on the death penalty are much more 50-50, like there are other views involved. So that's kind of the idea. Yes.
I think it sometimes sort of gets into this slippery slope type arguments, when I know this was a bit stance, but when the San Bernardino shooter, when the FBI was trying to get into their iPhone, the reason why Apple, or one of the arguments way forward is that if they didn't consider the privacy of one person, they wouldn't consider the privacy of them all, because then eventually it would just be if we don't value this moral principle in the United States of privacy freedom, then they can just be taken away from everyone.
So let's extend that a little bit. First of all, is everybody familiar with the incident that she's talking about? Okay, just wanted to make sure, because it's been a couple of years. So at that time, technology companies were, for the most part, standing up against government intrusion of privacy. They were basically saying, we don't want to violate privacy laws. And over time, that position by many technology companies has changed. Some of it has been done by law. Laws have been passed. And in some cases, they have gone through appellate adjudication to be determined to be constitutional. But in some cases, companies have changed their philosophies because they simply don't want the headache of dealing with the government. And it leads to an example that came up last week through, how many of y'all listen to Joe Rogan? Okay, some of you do. Joe Rogan's talking to Mark Zuckerberg, who all of you should know. And Zuckerberg has explained to him how the FBI called Facebook and told their staff, well, there's this possibility of some disinformation coming out from potential journalists about stories involving the son of then a presidential candidate. We would strongly encourage you or recommend that you do your best to not make this information as readily available to the public as possible through your newsfeed. So Facebook kind of said, okay. That's what they did. I'm not here to get into the political debate about whether or not the information was accurate or not, or whether it should have been made available or that it should have influenced the election. I'm just simply here to say that, in generally speaking, when we think of a free society and freedom of information, that's kind of a little bit of a stretch in terms of the federal government. That's kind of a stretch of authority by a federal agency telling a private company, you shouldn't publish that. Even though all they're doing is letting somebody else publish it on their platform. They're not the ones creating the content, they're simply allowing another entity to do that. So that's, you can see the slippery slope in that case. We go from a situation where a very bad incident happened, basically a domestic terrorist event happened in this country where people were killed. And law enforcement authorities are making a request that we all can probably sympathize with, in that these people had a phone. We need to know what's on the phone so that we can do evidence. The company actually says, wait a second here. We don't want to give the government the right to basically pull people information off phones because we have a privacy policy that protects that right. We understand the reason why you want it. We understand that, but we're not going to do this. And that change, and now we're to this point. There's an issue we deal with in municipalities with the content of police body-worn cameras. Bring up technology. Technology is proving to be a challenge here. Rocky Mount was one of the first jurisdictions in the state to be able to deploy body-worn cameras to all of our officers. And that was because we just had the right scale to be able to do that. We had about 100 and something, we have about 120 sworn officers. So we were able to do it in an affordable fashion. And body-worn cameras, if you know anything about them, are not like the kind of cameras you can just buy off Amazon. These are very expensive cameras because the data has to be encrypted. It has to be GPS enabled. There's a lot of work that has to be done with these cameras so that they can't be tampered with and that they work properly. Because, like, for example, when lights and sirens go off in the car, the camera goes on. When an officer leaves the vehicle, the camera goes on. Those safeguards are put in place because, one, you don't want to make an officer have to turn a camera on when they're responding to a call, and two, you don't want to give them that choice. So we go through all this, but as we've learned, the question then becomes, okay, we capture an incident that's a question that has potential questionable behavior by an officer or involves a violent incident. When is that footage going to be made available to the public? It's there. Chances are there's a 50-50 chance somebody else captured something on a cell phone in the near vicinity. That body worn cam provides a different angle that can kind of help us understand the incident more. When is it going to be made available? And in North Carolina, the way the Police Chiefs Association was able to work the laws is, well, you got to go to a judge to get the approval. 9 out of 10, first of all, 99% of judges are former prosecutors. The other are usually private practice lawyers. Very few defense attorneys become judges. Very few, especially in a state where you elect them. So, because voters don't like to vote for defense attorneys. I'm not trying to be, it's, I mean, you look at behavior. Who do they want to be a judge? Do they want to be a judge that's going to be soft on crime mentality? Who are they going to want to be a judge? The prosecutor who puts them in jail, or the defense attorney trying to keep them out of jail? That's the challenge. So like of the judges that, I mean, I kind of live in a weird district in the fact that half of them are former prosecutors and half of them are former private practice attorneys who have defended. That's not the case in every district. In a lot of districts, they're all former prosecutors. So but the reality is you got to go to a judge who is likely, based on their own philosophies, to say, I'm not going to turn over the footage. I'm not going to, which hurts everybody involved. It hurts the defense, obviously. It hurts the victim's family because they're not seeing for this. You have to work ways for them to see it. The public perception is affected because the public can't see it. And honestly, it hurts the prosecution to some extent because they're not able to defend their action. Because the way we look at body-worn cameras in government is that not only does it help prevent potential situations where officers can go beyond, can abuse power, it also protects us when they do things properly. So, you know, it's a very difficult situation. And it's not something we figured out how to work out yet. So we're still working through it. It's an excellent technology. I'm all for it. It's trying to figure out how to make it work and how to make it work in a way that the public has, that we meet all the elements of it. Yes.
So technology has brought us into a space where we really have to consider what is a public record, right?
Yes.
And what even 25 years ago didn't exist, we didn't think. So we, you know, when I was in the news business, it was, you know, if it was written down, it was public record.
Yes.
Typed, handwritten, didn't matter in the course of doing the business of the government. But now you've got email, text messages,
Yes.
you know, and now you have video archival, you know, that could be in the public interest. So to what degree? In a case of law enforcement, there is an investigative imperative there to keep it
Right.
away from the public's eyes for a time being. But if anything else should be presented at trial. But there is sometimes an imperative to say, here's what we see, and it's exonerated sometimes, police.
It does have that power. The challenge is, particularly when you have incidents now, is there is a greater demand, understandably so, to understand what the truth is. That all changed with Rodney King. Because that tape was released 2 days after the incident happened. So for over 30 years, we've been kind of dealing with this problem because that was the first case where we had external footage. And and so since then, we've kind of been working through this. I could go for hours about public information issues with local governments in terms of information, because I've experienced it a lot of times myself. Yes, ma'am.
Thinking about this, like, I guess regulation that in North Carolina that you have to get approval from the judge, and the judge could deny it. Is that not violate? Has to disclose evidence.
They have to disclose evidence to the defense, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a public record. And what they can do is say, to your point, what a lot of times will happen is that they won't release it until there is a charge. So in the investigation phase, in the investigation phase, that's not part of it. Discovery starts once a charge has been left.
So they're giving themselves enough time.
Mhm. Right. And because of the nature of all of us in today's world with technology, that's not soon enough for us. And understandably, I mean, that is a conflict that we have in that we want the information, but they have to do their investigation. And there are, I mean, that the situation that happened, I think last year in Elizabeth City is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to steal, but the Elizabeth City, I was immediately thinking, and I know I follow this a little bit because ECSU's police chief is our former police chief, but they, that case was an example because ECSU had the technology. ECSU is also a city with a lot of challenges, and the county has a lot of challenges. And I'm not excusing how things happened, but clearly they weren't doing what they needed to do in a time. And that affected public perception about what they were doing. Because unfortunately, the laws and the policies with respect to police officers, when they engage in an active shoot or in a situation where they have to exert force, by law, they lean to their favor. And so that is a serious issue. Because if that happens to a civilian, it doesn't lean to you. Now, you still are innocent until proven guilty, but you can be incarcerated until you're proven guilty. And the investigation itself is not to your advantage. Yes.
Didn't they show the family before they let it go public?
They did, yes. They worked it out to where the family got to see it with their attorney to be able to sit down. Yes.
I think the intent plays a huge role in this, just like the ball shooting at a Boston Marathon bombing was enough. Because on how that situation is labeled dictates a lot. Rules change, whole nother ball gets open. Absolutely. So when every situation is completely different. And that's to make that call. If I release this footage, what's the effects and the cascading effects from it? Is this going to cool things off, or is this going to intensify things that's already hot? You don't.
It's
for everybody.
And it's back to, obviously from a utilitarian perspective, you would see it one way, comp would see it a different way. Anybody else? Take a break. Libertarianism, probably the most misunderstood concept in all of political philosophy, or has the widest understanding. They misunderstood, has the widest terms of definition. So what's libertarianism? Or at least how does the author define it? Yes.
Giving people the most freedom.
Yeah. It's the idea that the best way to go about things is to yield as much authority as possible to the individual. American libertarians, for the most part, believe that when it comes to the role of government, it should be simply to protect life and liberty of its citizens. That the powers of government should be restricted to the extent that it's only necessary when you're dealing with life and liberty. So that obviously there are multiple degrees of that and different factions of it. Yes.
I'm sorry, I hate to.
No, that's fine.
It's also life, liberty, and property.
Yes.
And John Locke,
yes.
There's a Lockean argument actually for abortion, because a very extreme libertarian views that your child is your property, and you can do with it what you wish. So there is
And Rand Paul, and as we know, Rand Paul, who's the most libertarian member of the Senate, disagrees with that.
Libertarian.
So, the most libertarian member of the Senate. Not saying he's fully libertarian, he's the most libertarian.
There's like what actually is libertarianism and who calls himself a libertarian is really complex. It's
Yeah.
sometimes a way to say like I'm right wing, but like kind of soften the blow a little.
Mhm. I understand that. There's, so libertarianism has a wide, as you can see, has a wide range. It is normally in culture associated with the right. But you can also be to the left and be a libertarian. So it crosses both here. Its polar opposite is authoritarian. If you looked at it from, if you've ever taken one of those tests, you know, you got authoritarian and libertarian down here. So you got left and right, authoritarian, libertarian. And of course, all different kinds of ideologies flow in the middle. So there is a particular type of libertarianism, and I shared a video with you about it, called anarcho-capitalism. I actually know some anarcho-capitalists. I also know some capitalists, but I know some anarcho-capitalists. Anybody want to try to define for me what anarcho-capitalism is?
Is it like pure market, basically?
Basically, yes, that everything can be determined by the market. Necessarily need, and also that there's not necessarily a need for formal structure, that the market can be the structure. So what that would mean is it doesn't go so far as what I like to call the wall of the gun, where basically we all carry guns around and, you know, kind of like you see in Western, which wasn't exactly how it was in the West, but you get the idea. That you, that basically whatever you need to be provided will be provided by the market, and that the market will, that the interests of the market are the interests of society and interests of the people. Yes.
Isn't one of the core functions that there is a lack of states as well? Like they believe there shouldn't be governmental
Structure. Like the people that I know that are anarcho-capitalists work for a company that's actually based in Europe, where they advocate for a management philosophy where there's not hierarchy. That everybody's that every employee within an organization is self-governed. It's nuts. But it's sometimes it feels that way when we have work from home, but it's nuts. And but they work for this company and they consult others, and mostly they work with small businesses. But it's the idea that you can facilitate success within an organization without having somebody report to somebody else. Yes.
Right, so these people, you know, there's no like managerial oversight at all.
Exactly. You basically have a set of rules that basically achieve the goals of the company. And that everybody, that you have a defined role within the company, but that you are not, nobody is your boss and nobody is your reportee.
Promote yourself.
That's what. They didn't exactly give me an answer. Basically, it's basically, I think the philosophy is you're hired or you're fired. So I mean, that's kind of the way it works. But they're interesting. They're nice people, but they're interesting.
Yeah, very.
You're like a collective.
It's not necessary. There's facilitation, but you don't have leadership.
Who's hired?
Authoritarian.
Well,
Sorry,
they're all equal.
That's true.
Hive is what?
but there's the queen. I watched we watched the second season of Picard and
See it, I haven't got it.
watched the second season of Picard. It'll explain. But I'm sorry, go ahead. It sounded like you had a question. That's okay.
Yeah.
But there was something in here that I was going to bring up and I can't remember. It talked about, in terms of application, there was something in here and I think it goes back earlier that I was going to bring up, dealing with, I think it tied into, I forget exactly where it was, but it talked about, you know, the idea of somebody who believes that you should pay taxes as opposed to give to charity. And we know somebody, his name is Bernie Sanders. And because that's what he'll say, he openly says, charity's bad, government's good. And he says, it's not a problem to be rich necessarily, it's just that you should pay a lot of taxes. And why would somebody argue for government as opposed to charity?
Because they can control it. Well, I mean, if he's in the government, he's controlling it, yes.
That's certainly true. What's another example? What's
The
another?
argument in the reading was that, like, you just give to charity, you're just one person giving to charity, and you can't make a big difference, but if everybody's forced to give to the government, then you can make a substantial difference overall.
So you're right. It facilitates a certain, it kind of directs control. That's also true. It also is enabled to assemble the greatest pool of resources available to achieve good. What we find in practice is that in some ways charity is better. And there are times when government's better. It honestly depends on the problem you're trying to solve. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to do an exercise to finish out, a discussion to finish out. But everyone's doing great. Thank you all. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Okay, so we're back. What I've decided to do for our group exercise is to have a discussion about a matter that has come up in the last week that many of y'all, it probably does affect many of you. And that is the decision by the president to forgive, for the federal government to forgive either all or, for some of you, maybe all, for others of you, maybe a portion of your student loans, as well as the student loans of everybody else. What I would like to do is to go back to, and I'm going to bring it back up so that we have it for reference. I would like to look at it from these perspectives. Utilitarian, egalitarian, Kantian, and libertarian. Don't worry about the anarcho-capitalists, because obviously they don't even believe there should be student loans, at least not federally provided student loans. From these four ideologies, as well as anything else covered in chapter 1. And you can say for or against, I'm not saying, you can say from both perspectives. Obviously, this is a very significant issue. Significant price tag. And it has a significant effect on people. It's also done, and I always look at timing about things, and this comes up, just as we're getting back to Labor Day week. Labor Day, which is kind of the official kickoff of election season and football season. I'm more excited about the latter than the first one. The reality is that if it was intended to polarize our society in terms of their views on a particular issue, mission accomplished. Because most people have either a strong opinion for it or a strong opinion against it, one way or the other. So when we look at how a decision like this is made, and regardless of what you think about the president and how perhaps he's made decisions, or perhaps he's allowed his staff to make decisions or whatever, I truly believe he made this decision. That he personally made this decision. Did not, and may have taken advice from people, but he made this decision. This is the buck stopped with him on this, whether you like it or not. And so I want to look at it from these perspectives. So can somebody, and again, debate class, doesn't mean you have to agree with it personally, but just theorize it, conceptualize it. Can somebody make for me a utilitarian argument for why eliminating $10,000 to $20,000 of student loan debt would be a good idea. Yes.
Would it be that, like, a number of people who hold their student loan?
That's pretty clear. A lot of people have argued, particularly amongst generations that are represented in this room and online, that one of the biggest issues we have is that when we look at the household or personal budgets of people who've taken out these loans, it's a considerable burden on their cash flow and on their monthly annual expenses. And we do see where it is precluding them or preventing them from doing so. By starting a family, yes.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, if you take the idea of like the veil of ignorance and like, so obviously some people, like, their parents can pay for like their college completely, and they don't take out any loans. And so some people have no student debt, and then someone has $100,000 of student debt. You kind of take out, like, knowing, like, what if you say, oh, we're gonna randomly give certain people some student debt and some people no student debt, almost like it's more equal for like everyone's well-being, for like, you just have no student debt. I don't know if that made sense.
Well, that was one, I mean, some people would say that's the most politically efficient answer he should have made. He should have said, if some people were like, even if they don't agree with it, they would say like, why did you just do $10,000, $20,000? Why not just wipe it all out? Yeah. Said, there's many people on both sides of the issue said, this is not the most politically effective decision that you could have made. Yes.
Expanding on that, because that was like the Rawlsian argument.
Mm-hmm.
So the argument, the egalitarian argument for the student loan forgiveness is that if all those circumstances, most people would agree that going to college is almost like the loans, and it was going to just be randomly decided by a generator how many loans you have, what your income would be, and everything. Would you want to do student loan forgiveness or not, considering you could be randomly born into a family that makes $50,000 a year, not be able to afford it, and then never be able to retire because you can't pay off your
Yes.
And then the argument for the child, the E word, I cannot get that one out.
The ontological, the Kantian,
Oh, no, I was.
the egalitarian. Okay, you're going with egalitarian. Go ahead. Yeah.
Justice behind it is like one of the people saying, well, we've already paid ours, it's not fair to me.
The anti-argument.
Yeah.
And that's and that's one of them. So yes, Keston.
Sorry, I had my hand up for the utilitarianism. Is it okay if I talk about that?
Absolutely, go ahead.
So from my perspective, like if I were to use that frame of mind, it helps more people than it hurts. And the reason that from my perspective, it's not actually costing anyone any money. Like the taxes are not paying for this because the amount of debt being forgiven is less than the amount of debt that was created by the capitalized interest on the original loans in the first place. So from my perspective, it's helping more people than it's hurting. I'm sorry, did you say something?
Yeah, I was saying it's basically a balance sheet transfer.
Right.
Got it. Okay. Yes.
I was gonna take a utilitarian standpoint. So like, obviously, like in our economy right now, we have a lot.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, could this be? Sent back to the government and the individuals.
Most economists would say the opposite. Why is that? Because money supply, because what you're describing has been done in the past as a deflation in terms of the government consuming money from the population has been used as a policy to try to facilitate or reduce inflation. Because from a economic perspective in the modern economy, again, the base definition of inflation, and there's many different ones, but But the base definition of inflation that we have, based on what our economy is too much money chasing too few goods. Whatever those goods are and whatever we consider money. And the money supply, if the money supply is not in a position to be balanced with the amount of goods that are out there, and if the money supply is greater, you're going to have inflation. If the money supply is less than what's out there, you're going to have deflation. And what's happened, particularly with what's happened in the last 2 years, where we dramatically increased the money supply by a significant multiple, that created a situation, and supply of goods has not increased consistent with that, especially in necessary consumables, energy, food, housing, those type of things. You have an inflationary situation. And what the government is effectively doing by this is they are basically saying to somebody who's paying let's say you had a student loan bill of $250 a month. If that bill, say, were to go down to, say, $150 a month, or because of the fact that you have less than $10,000 in debt, it gets wiped out, and you don't have that $250 bill anymore. That's $250 of more money that you have to contribute into the economy, which means you're effectively increasing the money supply. The government can only reduce the money supply by actually pulling money out of it. When it spends money and when we spend money, it increases the money supply. When it contracts the money supply, there's only a few ways it can do that. Taxation without spending being one. And telling banks to hold back and using interest rate and raising interest rates. There's only a handful of ways you can actually reduce the money supply. The last time that happened successfully was in the early 80s, which was also the last time we had inflation like this, where we actually contracted the money supply significant enough to catch up with growth in supply, with supply of goods, to where then we were able to go from high inflation to low inflation. And we lucked out that we started having the start of globalization, which expanded supply of goods. So from an economics perspective, that's what the case would be.
Okay.
So this will not facilitate deflation.
But people haven't been paying off their student loans for 2 years, right?
Some have, some haven't. And it's still, for a lot of people, they see it as this pending expense that they have. And if they're rational, and again, this is where economists sometimes get it wrong. If they're rational, they're sitting there figuring out, because technically up until last week, we were all supposed to start paying again in September. They're sitting there saying, I'm going to have to start paying this $250. And now they're being told, you don't have to pay the $250. Because in one case, we also extended the forbearance and the deferment until January. So you've effectively, in a rational case, done that. Now, there can be irrational people where, and I think this is going to be the case, I don't think it's going to be, they're saying it's going to lead to a significant inflation. I don't think it will, because people have been spending the money anyway because they've had to. That's kind of what they've had to. So it may not raise inflation, but it's not going to lead to deflation. Yes.
So I think it's difficult to make a pro-utilitarian argument for it without. It's really hard to say that going to college would be the best use of your time without understanding what people are studying and what that money could be used for. Otherwise, it was used for different purposes.
And that data is possible. The problem is that you're doing it in retrospect. That's already been, this is something just to think about.
Yes.
This debt's already been incurred. And it's incurred because, as we brought up, society has created a belief that in order for you to advance yourself in terms of your quality of life, college degree to be able to obtain the job that will provide the level of income necessary to facilitate that. And that's now the standard. It used to be there were considered multiple ways of doing it. And we've worked under the premise now for about 35 to 40 years and it really started more in the 90s, but it also occurred in the 80s, that for a person to have a career that would yield positive, an income positive to generate wealth, that they would need a college degree. That was the assumption. Now, what we've learned in practice is, for many people, it is true. There are also other ways to be able to achieve the same thing without getting a 4-year degree, most of which require some degree of post-secondary education. Some kind of post-secondary education has to be acquired, but it is possible. And for a lot of people, it's still necessary because not everybody has the next new idea. Not everybody has, natural talent in something that our market puts a very high price on. So there are people who can succeed without the benefits of formal education. There are some people who could succeed without having to have 4-year education. For a lot of people, however, their path to success, and I would consider myself one of them, is 4-year education and beyond. And that was drilled into me by my family. My dad was the first person in his entire family to go to college. Nobody in his entire family, going back all the way to when they came here from Wales, had ever gone to college. He was the first one. And his parents, my grandparents, neither of whom went to college. Neither went to college. My grandfather barely graduated high school. Both of them, in their own way, they didn't say you need to be this or this. They said you need to put yourself in a position to go to college. So that, and my parents did the same. Both my parents were college educated, but that was the mentality because that was the assumed result. And that was reinforced by policy and communication for decades. And we are starting to reconsider it because the facts show us there are multiple paths. All of us that are involved in that have to be honest so that we went to college. And sometimes when I sit there and I read articles about people, you don't need to go to college. I know you went to college. You got a PhD. I don't. So I know you went there. So we have and have a certain degree of perspective and understand that that we can do that evaluation, but it doesn't change the fact that those decisions about taking out debt were made without that knowledge.
Agree. Libertarian argument why I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Sure, go ahead. Absolutely. No, that's why I wanted positive and negative of all of them.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard to find a positive from the libertarian perspective, but I certainly want, but yes, go ahead.
I mean, what do you think? Why not? Like they should have been given because it's not providing. Like people knew what they were getting into when they obtained the debt, and it's not really providing equal opportunity to older people. Like it's just like a time frame. They just say it sounds a little bit like libertarian.
Well, and what the libertarians would say is it's not my responsibility to take care of you. They would say they'd say it's not, they would say government, they would say I should not be forced to take care of you because you're violating my life and property in terms of the fact that I'm having to contribute. Even though someone could say it's a balance sheet transfer, you're not really making it. Okay, I had 4 hands that raised up, so start with you and then her and then you and then you. So go ahead.
I don't know if it's a stretch, but like with libertarianism, believing from operating at your freest self, that being a big goal, and it being the government's mistake that it even allowed people to get into student loan debt.
That's entirely possible, and you should call Dave Ramsey. So, because that would act, I think you might, I mean, they would have to answer that question. But because on the first part, Dave would say, well, you shouldn't have done it in the first place because he's that way about all kinds of debt. But the reality to your point is that debt was predicated on a false pretense, is what you're basically saying. That's a good question. And I would argue that there's a shared responsibility in that society, i.e. government, has to take responsibility for advocating for a policy that requires, in order to take advantage of it, requires somebody to take on debt. When society and government create jobs, and government has these jobs that say, a requirement for this job is a 4-year degree. And this is something we're having discussions about, saying, should we continue with this policy? And in some jobs, we're saying, yes, we should not have 4-year degree requirements. We can prefer one, but not require one. But when you set job requirements that say you need a 4-year degree or a graduate degree, you create an entry cost because you have to get a degree to have any chance of that job. And so what we're saying is, yeah, we're going to require to have this education, but we're not creating an environment to where we can meet the other end of that, which is we're going to provide you with the pay and the benefits necessary for you to meet your cost of living and generate wealth. So that's one way of looking at it. On the other hand, you could also say that you still are making the choice, because there's no guarantee, even with a 4-year degree, that you get the job. Does that make sense? So what we're saying is, you as an individual have multiple options. You're choosing to go this path. There's no guarantee on that. We haven't, I mean, very rarely, and typically not with 4-year degrees, unless you join the military, do we guarantee a job upon graduation. The programs where we do are typically firefighters, police officers, electric linemen, sometimes nurses. That's about it. Even doctors aren't necessarily guaranteed jobs when they graduate. The only way to get a 4-year degree and be guaranteed, the only wide opportunity to be guaranteed a job after getting a 4-year degree is to get money from the military. I tried and I got medically deferred. So that's how my dad paid for college. The military said, we'll pay for it. He signed up, he was going to go in the military anyway. He served for 20 years. But that's the reality. So it's kind of, so in reality, it's a shared responsibility. The problem is, in the political discussion, we're either saying it's this side's responsibility, or it's the responsibility of the individuals whose name is on the loan. And that's not right. But unfortunately, because of the nature of where we are politically speaking right now, and in the work in public policy, we always have to be aware of political reality, because it influences not only the public that we serve, but the politicians and elected leaders who we have to influence when it comes to developing policy. We have to figure out address it. Okay.
I was actually going to say something very similar about libertarianism, is that you have the argument for, saying that as an individual, it increases my chances of personal liberty and freedom, because I'm now unencumbered by this debt that I have. But also say that, one, it doesn't fix any of the problems. There's still predatory loans being issued.
Yes.
The cost of college education is too high. Like, the demands of society are too high. So
it's a symptom, not the illness.
right.
But maybe it fits into libertarianism, but the idea that canceling $10,000 to $20,000 worth of debt is sort of like a repayment to everybody for underfunding public universities and also charging interest. So interest higher than mortgage rates and even car loans.
Yes.
On federally, federal loans, right?
Yeah, and like, for example, the biggest no-brainer that they didn't do for me, and this happened to me 20 years ago, because I did take out some loans for graduate school. 2000s, the federal government did this massive refinancing program, huge refinancing program. Basically, everybody was eligible. And they basically said, we're going to refinance your loan at somewhere between 2 and 2.5%, which for a lot of people was phenomenal. And they did that across the board. And that did a lot for them. And they haven't done it since. And I'm like, why not do that? Why not do that first? You know, that's the easiest bipartisan, practical, applicable way that you can give something to people immediately and help them out. Because the biggest challenge that a lot of people have is the interest rate.
Yeah, I did that and somehow ended up with 7.5%. I have no idea what I did wrong, but.
I'm sorry, and I apologize.
No, it's not you.
Yeah, I
And it turned out to
understand.
be a private loan that wasn't forgivable under the Public Service Forgiveness Act, right? And
Yeah.
I was even
Oh, yeah,
more
and that's even worse.
Right?
So now let's talk about, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So in August of last year, I made my last payment on my bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm free and clear of all loans until I took a new one last August to come here. But I fully support the idea of forgiving 10 to 20,000 or even more because of the fact that there is not a much more affordable public university option in this country. And the fact that interest rates on federally subsidized and, you know, public loans, not the private loans, are so high. There's no reason why our government should be making money on top of the money we're paying. Except maybe a small, you know, like the administrative cost that it takes to carry that debt year after.
It is a conundrum, and I totally agree with that. So let's talk about public sector loan forgiveness. So that came along next, and I applied for it just as I went ahead and registered myself as soon as I could. And I paid my 10 years. And then I filed to say, okay, I'm gonna get the rest of this loan forgiven. I don't mind paying what I paid. And I took the loan out knowing I was likely gonna have, and it wasn't a huge amount of money. But I paid it. I signed up for it, and then of course I'm told, like you, sorry, you're not eligible. Because they didn't tell us when we took out the refi that the refi program didn't put the level of payment at a point where it was not qualified. Generally I say this, and yes, I'm a public sector employee, and I will say, generally when the government does something to offer benefit, I think you're gonna screw. That's my general philosophy. I mean, same way I feel about my pension. And so the fact is, so it took 4 years for them to finally, earlier this year, tell me, congratulations, we're now forgiven. And, you know, luckily I had 2 years where I hadn't to pay because I was under the same, we were all under the same. And they gave me back a little bit of the money that I had paid after I was technically eligible. Because I paid for a couple of years in between that. And they gave me some of that money back. Not all of it, but some of it. Didn't give me the interest on what I had paid, just like the IRS doesn't give you interest on tax refunds. What I will tell you is, when the government charges interest, it's really good at it. When issues loans and charges interest, it's the reason why we typically don't when governments finance projects, we typically don't recommend using federal programs to do it. The USDA has huge programs to finance just about everything: fire trucks, fire stations, water improvements, sewer improvements, buildings for small towns. And they will finance to terms of 50 years. Insane interest rates. I've had a town just north of us who's called us for 10 years saying, can you help us out by taking over our utilities? They want us, we sell water to them. They want us to take it over and just run it ourselves. I look at it and I go, in no way am I taking that loan. In no way am I taking that loan, and I can't get it canceled. So I'm not taking that one. Her in the back, and you had.
One of the potentially like a libertarian argument for it comes to the idea, and you sort of found this idea of choice. If someone, for example, experiment philosophy, whatever, if someone had the gun here and say like, sing your ABCs or I'm going to shoot you, technically you have the choice to not sing your ABCs, but is it a free, unencumbered choice? Mm-hmm. So in the United States, as we kind of like hit on before, do you have unencumbered choice to choose whether or not to take on debt to have education if the ultimate goal is to, live a good life, work, and then retire at some point. 90, well, you're gonna have to get a higher education degree, and so it's not an unencumbered choice, and because the freedom to choose unencumbered was not there, I mean, that could be a libertarian argument for forgiveness.
That's a fair way and a fair way to look at it. I would also say there'd be a lot of empathetic parents who suggesting anybody choose. And I'm not saying that's a fair statement to make. I'm just saying that the people who will make that statement. Yes.
I've been going back and forth with this one. And just basically dealing with someone. Similar to me. But when I look at the trend of how we got to this and what he was just talking about, the public service, everything, it seems the last 6 months they've been kind of running in tandem, where they're more moral based, where it's the viewpoint, we are going to help people who've been paying, who've been dealing with this forever, who this been drastically helped, who have not been helped by public service repayment. And if it benefits other people, that's fantastic. It makes it more palatable.
That's a possibility that may have factored into the calculus. I mean, what we know politically speaking, I think I'll say it just to make sure everybody knows, is that when Biden ran for president, he promised forgiveness. Now, he parsed his words in a way that people basically assumed it meant what they wanted it to. So for a lot of people, they assumed total forgiveness. For other people, they assumed that it meant, okay, I'm going to get half off or something like that. And so what you're saying, and the fact that one argument can be made that while we know by action that there are a lot of people who have benefited financially during this COVID period and the subsequent changes in the labor market, there are people who have benefited who wouldn't have been able to have benefited before because so much got disrupted and have been able to move into new jobs or get promoted or find other ways and have seen their incomes go up. There's a lot of people who haven't. And so because of disruption, it creates an unintended injury, which you can argue should be compensated. Now, somebody would also say, well, I didn't take out loans and I got disrupted. Where's my money? I'm not saying that that's right. I'm saying somebody could say that.
I'm just saying it seems like in tandem because I'm coming up on 10 years of
Okay.
service. Over the last 6 months, Nelnet has been pestering me like, we can now consolidate your private and your federal and we can qualify you in a year.
I still get calls.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm done. So, I mean,
I'm forgiving now.
yeah, congratulations. But in fact, that's the case where then they don't have to go to PSL. You don't have to worry about PSLF. Because you were like I'm not just throwing out a number 8,500, and they're like, okay, well, okay, done early, no problem there. PSLF I think was a necessary program because the fact is we need people in public service. And generally speaking, local governments and state governments don't have a lot of resources at their disposal to be able to provide an incentive to encourage people to join public service, particularly in the key areas like public health, education, and others. We don't have those resources. They didn't mean to do it for bureaucrats like me, but they did it anyway. And so the reality is the fact, so they put together a program that has worked once they figured out that it wasn't working. And then of course, obviously we have other cases where there seems to be no problem with forgiveness, and that involves degree mills. Most of you are not old enough to remember when ITT Technical Institute ran commercials every day, 5 or 6 commercials every hour while you were watching some court show or talk show, trying to convince you to get a degree from them. They ran that for decades. And basically they were just handing out paper that had no value to it. The employers didn't have any value to it, so they didn't hire anybody who had one. That was a scam, straight up scam. And so right 2 weeks ago, they finally wrote off about $3 billion in loans that they had taken out because that was an example of a scam. And there are some people who believe in general the college system is in some ways. And what I would say is that the college system has a challenge in the fact that the college system, while there are many options, is not competitive from the standpoint of price. Theoretically, there would be a way to facilitate a college system, a college market, where there would be price variables for most of us. Now, we realize that there are those few institutions, Duke, High Point, to give an example, that charge a lot more. There's an expectation that comes with it, something that you're going to get from that. There's also a lot of small private universities that charge a lot to people. But then there's also a lot of public universities that, while they're charging more than they did when I was a kid, when I was going through, there is a significant difference. And that's a combination of the fact that supplemental funding coming from states has not grown with that or decreased in some cases, because at that time that policymakers were looking at it in the late 90s, we had this issue in Tennessee. They were looking at it and they were going, that's pretty low for what the student is having to pay. They purposely said the student needs to pay more. That was a decision that was made in the 90s. So they changed policies. It used to be, for example, I don't remember what it is now here, but it used to be that if you went to a school and you took, like, say, if you were on a semester system and you took 12 hours, you were considered a full-time student. So all the remaining hours you took in that semester were free. So you could have an 18-hour load, which I wouldn't recommend, but you could have an 18-hour semester load, and you'd only be paying theoretically for 12 hours. And that was standard operating procedure. And because the nature of the relationship between supplemental funding from the state being paid for by the taxpayers and what was being paid by the student changed, that of course led to what we have now, where you basically pay for every hour you attend. So the fact is that's a part of it. So there's two aspects. One, there's the fact that the universities are more responsible for generating their own revenue. And second, they've kind of gotten into the business of providing a lot of amenities that we did not have 25, 30 years ago. College experience in terms of dorm rooms, food service, libraries, other types of amenities that exist now on college campus, and especially a campus like NC State, are significantly different than they were 30 years ago. And I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, I'm just saying it's, and some of that does have a cost to it. And so there's a whole host of issues. You have better quality experience, lower subsidy level coming from the general government. And you have the fact that there is no incentive for the university, for most universities, because of the way that the loan system works, where the loan simply, because the government doesn't say, we're only going to pay $10,000 when it comes to tuition. Now there's some rules about what it pays beyond that, but if you go to them and say, my tuition's $18,000, it's going to pay it. If you go to them and say, my tuition's $22,000, it's going to pay it. So there's no incentive being provided. This is an argument that's made by some people, a lot of people, that there's no incentive for the university to structure its prices to come in line with, say, a cap on what the government or the bank is willing to pay, which puts you in more debt and takes out and only encourages the university to increase tuition, unless you go to Purdue, because they're the only school in the country, the only public university in the country who's kept rates the same for the last 7 to 8 years. So that's a challenge. Now, schools have gotten better the last couple of years, but I would imagine with inflation, next year's going to be horrendous. I have a feeling that will be the case. And then there's also the fact that universities do enough to really prepare you and put you in a position to be able to gain the employment that is consistent with the value of the degree that they say that they're selling to. I was on a panel, my last year as undergrad, I was on a panel, the student panel for the selection of a new university president at the school that I was to. And we had 5 finalist candidates. 4 of them, this was in 1999, 4 of them came in and talked about students as customers. This was a relatively new concept at the time, the idea of a student as a customer. Because these presidents, these people who want to be president, this included our internal candidate, who was the dean of business, who had been one of my scoutmasters in my scout troop, because I grew up in the same town. They basically said students are customers. We're providing a service to them that they're acquiring. And that was representative of a major change in the nature of the relationship, where at the very least the administration of the university, public, private, small, large, whatever, looks at it as a transactional relationship. You service. And education, in the way it was conceived, and it's gone through most of its history, has not been that. It's not a transactional relationship. There is the necessary resources to provide the education, but there's also an understanding that if you put the work, that really what you're contributing is your work, the work of study, the work of scholarship, contributing as well to the university, and that our responsibility is to prepare you to the best degree possible to be able to pursue a career that does generate positive wealth and for your future generations. And that relationship has been diminished to the more transactional customer relationship that exists now at practically any university. I'm not going to necessarily judge what the results of that are, because that's university to university. I'm not going to say overall college is, I'm not going to say that. But it's certainly an environment that lends itself, depending on where you go, depending on what's offered by the university in terms of programs, and how those programs relate to doing the work in the actual field that program is supposed to prepare you for, and lead to a situation of buyer programs. So it's 8:42. I apologize for that, but thank you all very much for your comments and for that. Y'all did a great job tonight. Very well prepared. So next week, the select project groups for the group projects, I'll need those names by 6 p.m. Tuesday night. The text readings are chapters 2 and 3. There is some additional viewing and reading in the week 3 folder. And also tomorrow I will be emailing the assignment for, I think podcast assignment 1 is the first assignment. I'll be emailing that out sometime tomorrow. You got 2 weeks. Are there any questions? Thank you all very much and have a good evening.